Everyone, happy Sunday. It is June 2nd, 2024. We're so happy to have each and every one of you as we are continuing in this series on The Guardian. Now, a quick introduction. Violetta is an artist and graphic designer living in Pointe-Noire in the Republic of Congo and is the co-founder with Adib Musumian of the Utterance Project. Violetta is also a researcher, writer, and presenter on Bahá'í history. She has given over 50 talks on the Clearwater Bahá'í's YouTube channel and is the author of 4 online illustrated chronologies on the lives of Baha'u'llah, the Bab, Abdul Baha, and the one we're discussing today, the Guardian, Shoghi Effendi. All links and details can be found in the description below the video. Now, as we start this next session, we welcome Clearwater Bahá'í's Immersive Ocean. We welcome Miss Violetta Zain as we begin our next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Welcome to The Guardian, Part 13, 1942 to 1945, God Passes By. We have finally arrived at one of my favorite parts of this chronology, the story of the Guardian's magnum opus. Now, this part is 71 pages long. It's encyclopedic, and there are several sections which I am going to cut entirely from my narration today. So if you want to know what they say, you can go to the chronology. It's going to be in the bottom of the description. You can click on it and read what I skipped. I'm not going to skip anything having to do with Shoghi Effendi at all. Everything I'm going to skip has to do with communities around the world and other believers, doesn't involve Shoghi Effendi. But I really want to focus on telling the story of God Passes By. This part covers the life of Shoghi Effendi from the age of 45 in 1942 to the age of 48 in 1945. 1942. Shoghi Effendi conceives and researches God Passes By. 1942, Shoghi Effendi's idea for the Centennial. Now, all of the backgrounds for God Passes By are going to be this collage of 150 pictures from the Dawnbreakers. And every black and white photo from the Bahá'í Media Bank. So you have 225 images on a 15 by 15 grid that are going to be the background for most of the illustrations for everything having to do with God Passes By. When Shoghi Effendi conceived of the idea of what was going to become God Passes By, the most befitting tribute of the centennial of the faith that he could come up with, it was to celebrate a triple centenary. The centenary of the Babi dispensation, the first 100 years of the Baha'i cycle, and the 100th anniversary of the birth of Abdul Baha. It was never the Guardian's intention to write a detailed, minute, exhaustive, encyclopedic history of these awe-inspiring, thrilling first 100 years. What the Guardian had in mind from the get-go was a review. In fact, in some of Ruhiya Khanum's diary entries for the years 1942 to 1945, when the Guardian was writing God Passes By, she called the manuscript he was working on the Centennial Review. There's a very good reason for that, because the title of God Passes By was the last thing that happened. And even Shoghi Effendi referred to the unnamed manuscript for 3 years as the survey. So what Shoghi Effendi understood as review and survey was a sweeping panorama of noteworthy, important features of the Baha'i faith and its rise from obscurity from Persia and the confines of the Ottoman Empire and Central Asia during the ministry of Baha'u'llah to North America and Europe, Australia, and Southeast Asia during the ministry of Shoghi Effendi, and the entire planet during what the Guardian called the formative age. Even though it was the guardianship, the Guardian would never, ever refer to this period of time as the guardianship. He would always refer to it as the period after Abdu'l-Baha's passing or the inception of the formative age. That is how humble our Guardian was. What Shoghi Effendi had in mind was to clearly delineate a central theme for the entirety of God Passes By. And this theme was, according to him, the series of external and internal crises that, through this mysterious spiritual release of divine power within it, propelled the faith forward from victory to victory. This mysterious process of crisis and victory. The Guardian had the intention of casting his infallible eye on the panorama of the Baha'i faith's first dynamic, momentous, extraordinary century. And in the way only the Guardian, as the expounder of the faith of Baha'u'llah, could, he wanted to interpret what had just happened between 1844 and 1944. Shoghi Effendi was planning to lift the curtain and shine the spotlight on the first 4 periods of the Baha'i faith, the ministries of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, and the first epoch of the formative age, which we understand as the guardianship as well. As Shoghi Effendi explains in the foreword of God Passes By, these 4 periods are closely interrelated and constitute successive acts of one indivisible, stupendous, and sublime drama, whose mystery no intellect can fathom, whose climax no eye can even dimly perceive, whose conclusion no mind can adequately foreshadow. The Guardian interprets history. After 20 years of interpreting Baha'u'llah's holy writings in translation, 23 years actually, the Guardian was going to interpret not only the history of the faith, but secular history. And this was an extremely daunting task. How could he do this and befittingly mark the first century of the Baha'i era? Shoghi Effendi's self-imposed task was absolutely Herculean. The conditions that he was going to work under would be stressful beyond belief and dangerous. And the deadline he imposed himself was almost impossible. The occasion of the Centennial, an occasion never to be repeated in the history of humanity and in the history of the Baha'i faith. So the pressure on Shoghi Effendi, and really the self-imposed pressure, because he is the one who tasked himself to do this, was absolutely immense. God Passes By would be the last major work the Guardian ever wrote. For the next 13 years, the Guardian would never translate or write anything else. No other book. God Passes By would be the Guardian's grand opus, his masterpiece. 1942, Shoghi Effendi's research on God Passes By. The first year, 1942 to 1943, of Shoghi Effendi's work on God Passes By, his first book and his only book, was to sit down for 12 months and read every book. Shoghi Effendi read every book of the Baha'i holy writings in Persian, in English, published or unpublished, in manuscript form. He read every book written about the faith by Baha'is. He read every single significant reference to the Baha'i faith that he could find in secular books. At least 200 books he read in the first year. As he read, Shoghi Effendi made notes in his small notebooks. And as he made notes, he organized and structured his facts. Historical research is extremely painstaking. It's grinding, repetitive, methodical, detail-oriented work that requires constant attention and self-discipline, but also work that requires wisdom and discernment. Often, the Guardian had to interpret history. He had to decide between two dates for the same event in two different sources, which of these was the likeliest. And then once he had read all the sources and taken all his notes, the real work of bringing his brilliant idea to life began, the writing process. 1942, 1943, the writing of God Passes By. 1942 to 1944, the circumstances under which Shoghi Effendi wrote God Passes By. Basically, frankly, the Guardian's circumstances while he wrote God Passes By were a living nightmare. Just plain to say. It was the middle of World War II. And there was danger everywhere, like we're going to see in the next story, that could directly threaten Shoghi Effendi or just hang above him like a menace for the entire rest of the war. Beyond Shoghi Effendi's personal safety, the years of the war were an unbearable stress for the Guardian because he was worried for 6 years about the life and the well-being and the safety of Baha'i communities worldwide. These worries that the Guardian felt for 6 years would only be allayed after the war had ended and he could be back in touch with all of the believers and all of the communities and not have the weight of the pressure of their safety without any possibility of getting any kind of answer weighing on him for years and years and years. It was very, very grinding. Ruhiya Khanum describes Shoghi Effendi's work environment almost like a pressure cooker. The stress he was under to meet a deadline of the 23rd of May, 1944, she says, Ruhiya Khanum, there was no possibility of working at a slower pace. He, Shoghi Effendi, was racing against time to present the Baha'is of the West with this inimitable gift on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the inception of their faith. You have to understand how utterly exhausted Shoghi Effendi was after 23 years of wearing the unbearably heavy mantle of the guardianship. Plus, in the middle of World War II, with all of the worries we've just described. Plus, all of Shoghi Effendi's family had turned against him now, 10 years after the passing of the greatest holy leaf, who had kept them all sort of in the covenant and calm and faithful. These covenant-breaking family members, Ruhiya Khanum said, crushed every ounce of spirit out of the Guardian. And covenant breaking was the only thing that ever truly made the Guardian physically ill. At the same time as he was undertaking this Herculean literary task, Shoghi Effendi was also planning the worldwide celebrations for the Centennial in those countries that were able to hold celebrations in the middle of World War II. And he made crucial decisions regarding the design of the superstructure of the Shrine of the Bab. So you see that he had pressure from all sides. Even this new building project of the superstructure of the Shrine of the Bab had begun to weigh on him, as well as the celebrations of the centenary in actual countries. So much pressure resting on the Guardian's shoulder was sometimes unbearable even to him, because the Guardian, and this is a theme I will return to again and again, the Guardian was infallible. He was divinely appointed. Abdu'l-Baha had named him his successor in his will and testament. For all of these reasons, the Guardian could not delegate because he was the only one who was infallible. So he can't delegate to someone else because that person would have been fallible. Shoghi Effendi just had to withstand the pressure and do the work. No one else could. No one else could help him, and no one else could relieve his burden. On the 20th of March, 1942, Shoghi Effendi is almost killed. This is a plane that was very popular during World War II called a Hawker Hurricane. On the 20th of March, 1942, the day before Nowruz, Shoghi Effendi was working on God Passes By when two Hawker Hurricane single-seater fighter planes of the 127th Squadron collided in mid-air over Haifa during training exercises. The planes lost control, crashed, and burned. One of the planes, as it was crashing, narrowly missed the master's house, where Ruhiya Khanum and Shoghi Effendi were. And it crashed at the lower end of their street, bursting into flames less than 100 meters away from the Guardian's home. Shoghi Effendi easily could have been killed by this plane crash. It was just a matter of 100 meters. Both pilots, Lieutenant Charles Henry Geelink of the South African Air Force, 24 years old, and Flying Officer John Lewis Ward of the British Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserves, 26, died in that crash. During the writing of God Passes By, Shoghi Effendi's despair. One day, Shoghi Effendi was translating out loud, as he was wont to do, and Ruhiya Khanum was in the room with him. It was a lifelong habit of the Guardian to always have someone present in the room when he wrote or translated. It was something he loved to have, like the presence of another soul. Ruhiya Khanum had the bounty of being the one in the Guardian's room or office whenever he wrote or translated for 20 years of their marriage, 1937 to 1957. Suddenly, the Guardian read to Ruhiya Khanum the words he had just stumbled upon. If the Baha'is had been occupied with that which we had commanded, now the entire world would be clothed in the robe of faith. Ruhiya Khanum was absolutely horrified, and she asked the Guardian, Shoghi Effendi, did Baha'u'llah mean it? Well, if he said it, if he wrote it, he must have meant it. When did he write it? In Baghdad. This was something that was very much on the Guardian's mind, and he despaired about it. He would often say to Ruhiya Khanum, lamenting over the condition of the world, do you realize it is over 100 years since Baha'u'llah appeared in this world? And what has been the response to his message? Ruhiya Khanum wanted to try and cheer Shoghi Effendi up, and she would say, but there are 12 national spiritual assemblies in the world, and there's Baha'is in so many countries. But the Guardian would just look at Ruhiya Khanum and say, there are millions of people in the world. What has been the response to Baha'u'llah? After this conversation, Ruhiya Khanum stated that she never again felt really, truly comfortable. Baha'u'llah and the Guardian were, in essence, stating categorically that humanity had failed Baha'u'llah. It was a universal failure. And he stated it in Baghdad, which means sometimes between 1853 and 1863. The historical aspect of this devastating quote of The Guardian was what made Ruhiya Khanum uncomfortable. If Baha'u'llah had said this during his own lifetime, his own ministry, what would he say of humanity's failure today? Baha'is can never be complacent about their service. It is never enough. 1942, 1943, writing God Passes By. The Guardian wove his notes and research together into a brilliantly hued tapestry of the first 100 years of the Baha'i faith, a work that would become the foundation of all future Baha'i histories and would forever be known as the crowning literary achievement of his ministry. After the one-year research process, Shoghi Effendi spent 1 year writing, and it was just as painful, just as painstaking, just as methodical, and just as excruciatingly detailed. He spent day after day, month after month, writing the manuscript longhand in his little notebooks while he spoke the sentences out loud. Ruhiya Khanum in the room at all times, present for the birth of this work of genius. Then the Guardian would write out a clean copy, not the ones in the notebook, a clean copy. Almost a year later, in January 1943, Shoghi Effendi was still slaving over God Passes By. He was so frustrated with his work. He entered Ruhiya Khanum's room, who tried to be helpful and suggested he read other historical books to find inspiration. And Shoghi Effendi responded, "I have no time. No time. For 20 years, I have had no time." On the 26th of June, 1943, George Townsend, Shoghi Effendi's literary counterpart in Ireland, paid Shoghi Effendi a spiritually perceptive compliment. I enclose the 7th installment of the survey. The work impresses me immensely, and I foresee it will arouse great public interest and will be of the highest value in strengthening the faithful and stimulating their teaching work. 27th of February, 1943, until February 1944, for a period of 1 year, the collaboration between Shoghi Effendi and George Townsend on God Passes By. This is a beautiful photograph of George Townsend, the Irish future hand of the cause, Irish deacon, and precious literary collaborator of Shoghi Effendi. The first time George Townsend ever heard of Shoghi Effendi's project, the survey, was in a letter the Guardian wrote him dated the 27th of February, 1942. Written probably by Ruhiya Khanum because it's written by his secretary, his English secretary. "The Guardian has instructed me to write to you on his behalf and to forward you the enclosed pages for your perusal. He has been working for quite some time on a book to be published in conjunction with the centenary celebrations of our religion in May 1944, and which would give, in relatively brief form, an outline of the most important phases and events in the evolution of our beloved faith during its first 100 years. So with the Guardian and George Townsend had a very well-oiled relationship. The Guardian would send George Townsend typed pages and describing their content and requesting George Townsend focus his attention on this aspect or certain issues or another aspect. He would just direct his attention. George Townsend would live and breathe and dream God Passes By for an entire and very intense year from February 43 to February 44. He worked through intense pain that he had in in both of his arms due to arthritis, and he could only work at sometimes with his left hand. He made light of it in his letters, sometimes telling the Guardian, "Not so bad with the left hand, is it?" The Guardian wrote George Townsend 20 letters between February 27th and August 11th. And he included the typewritten pages of God Passes By as they became available, not in strict chronological order. And he did not correct typos. He was working alone. He had no help. He had no typist. He was the one doing all the typing, and he had no time. George Townsend offered his editorial suggestions with his legendary tact and kindness. The wartime delay sending letters and batches of the manuscript back and forth were just absolutely horrific to work with. And Shoghi Effendi and George Townsend were constantly sending each other cables to determine which installment they'd received, which installment they had just sent, how long ago they had been sent, when they could be expected. And they had to decide, if too much time had gone by, if they needed to send the manuscript pages again, the ones that had not arrived. Now, what's very interesting is that we no longer have an introduction to God Passes By. But at the time that Shoghi Effendi and George Townsend were working on it, there was an introduction that had been written by George Townsend. It's very, very beautiful. And if you go to this section in the chronology and you scroll to the end here, you can find it on Baha'i Library online. And I'm just going to read you what is part of this graphic here. Here is a history of our times, written on an unfamiliar theme. A history filled with love and happiness, and vision and strength, telling of the triumphs gained and wider triumphs yet to come. He was an exquisite writer, just a really wonderful writer. End of December 1943, typing out God Passes By. And this is a lovely picture of a Corona typewriter, not the Corona typewriter, but it's the same model used by the Guardian. And it had been brought to Abdul Baha during Abdul Baha's ministry by the Randalls. On the 16th of November, 1919, the Randall family, Harry, Ruth, and their 12-year-old daughter, Bahá'í, arrived on pilgrimage with a trunk filled with gifts for Abdul Baha, which included a typewriter for Shoghi Effendi, a pocket watch for Abdul Baha, yards of soft wool fabric for the greatest holy leaf to sew into a coat for the master. That gift of a typewriter, that Corona typewriter, would go down in Baha'i history because it was on this typewriter that the Guardian typed all of his letters. From the advent of divine justice, the promised days come, the golden age code of Baha'u'llah, the world order of Baha'u'llah, and God Passes By. The Guardian was famous for, first of all, when he typed, he used a system of carbon paper, which means that when the metal letters type the ribbon and type the page, they can imprint themselves on like 3, 4, 5 copies of the, not just one. You can actually type multiple copies in one go. So that was very practical for him. The other thing that was very famous about the Guardian is that he used the 2-finger method for typing. And in typing, there's a term for this method. It's called the hunt and peck method. Hunt and peck, tuck, 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 tuck. And touch typing is when you type each finger has an allocated letter and it just types that letter and the thumbs do the space bar. But the hunt and peck method is you just use your two fingers on half of the keyboard and you just type the letters like this. Now, outwardly, you would think, oh, it's so much more practical to do the touch typing, like everybody does. But actually, over the long run, with someone who did as much typing as Shoghi Effendi, the hunt and peck two-finger approach is actually less stressful on the tendons of your hand and doesn't cause as much carpal tunnel syndrome or wrist pain or arthritis. So it's kind of a brilliant approach. And I am quite sure he was very quick. Shoghi Effendi used his Corona typewriter to type all the translations of the Abdul Baha's tablets to the West, every lengthy letter he would write, then all his translations, Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, gleanings from the writings of Baha'u'llah. And when he was running out of black ribbons, sometime in his early ministry, he immediately cabled his brother in Beirut, send with sister 10 Corona ribbons, color black. This Corona typewriter was what connected Shoghi Effendi to the Baha'i world. Once the handwritten draft of God Passes By was completed, Shoghi Effendi began hammering away the typescript of the manuscript on at least 3 carbon copies, using his two-finger method, 10 hours on end sometimes. And when Shoghi Effendi was at full speed, Ruhiya Khanum stated that he would type with 4 fingers. In the end, Shoghi Effendi would type up to 6 carbon copies of God Passes By. Shoghi Effendi burned through the summer of 1943, working so hard on the book that Ruhiya Khanum felt she had never seen him work so hard during a vacation. By November 1943, Shoghi Effendi had been working so hard on the manuscript for almost 2 years and repeatedly said to Ruhiya Khanum, "This book is killing me." And Ruhiya Khanum invariably answered, "Me too." C'est pas grave, Nicolas. Au revoir, mon chéri. Au revoir, les enfants. Sorry, my nephew's leaving. Finally, by the end of December 1943, an end was in sight. But before that, 1942, 1944, the achievements of the first 7-year plan. So before we go back to God Passes By and the publication and the reception of God Passes By in the world, I want to talk about the end of the first 7-year plan, the first teaching plan in history of the formative age. But again, before I get to that, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about Lydia Zamenhof, who was the daughter of L.L. Zamenhof, the inventor of Esperanto. She was a Baha'i, and her home in Warsaw, Poland, became part of the ghetto, and she was first arrested under the charge of having gone to the United States to spread anti-Nazi propaganda, which of course wasn't true. She was apolitical, but she faced her fate and remained firm in the Baha'i faith until the very end, when she was exterminated at the Treblinka camp in the summer of 1942. Shoghi Effendi sent a message to the Baha'is in America saying, "Heartily approve nationwide observance for dauntless Lydia Zamenhof. Her notable services, tenacity, modesty, unwavering, devotion fully merit high tribute American believers. Do not advise, however, designate her martyr." Also around 1942, something not having to do with anything in this in the plan, basically, was the finalized monument for May Maxwell, which was this beautiful monument designed by William Sutherland Maxwell and supervised by Amelia Collins. And the wings were drawn by Ruhiya Hanum. She sketched the wings. And Shoghi Effendi suggested putting urns on either side of the monument to make it less bare. So it really was like a real family effort, Maxwell Rabbani family effort. Sutherland Maxwell designed it. Ruhiya Hanum added the wings. Shoghi Effendi added the urns. This is a little vignette that I found really quite touching, because as much as Shoghi Effendi never wanted to be compared to the master, he had so many similar qualities and characteristics. And one of these was really his charitable contributions and his generosity to local causes. Whenever, during the British Mandate, any of the municipalities of Haifa or Akka, or even the state of Israel, needed cooperation or financial assistance, the Guardian offered it generously. In the early days of his ministry, in February 1923, Guardian offered a contribution of 1,500 pounds today, 20 pounds at the time, for the poor in Haifa. In 1925, he offered the same amount for the establishment of the Haifa Charitable Fund. A year later, in 1926, Shoghi Effendi offered more than 2,000 pounds in today's money for the poor and homeless of the Northern District of Palestine. 3 years later, he contributed over 3,000 pounds in today's money. All the numbers are in today's money, for the prevention of begging in Haifa. In 1934, the district commissioner of the Northern District thanked him for his generosity for the relief and distress in Tiberias. Between 1940 and 1952, the Guardian donated more than $116,000 to, sorry, I lost my space, to charitable causes and to alleviate the hardship and living conditions of the poor. In 1952, the mayor of Haifa, Abba Kushi, said that, there's a countrywide symposium on illuminations that's going to be taking place at the Technical College in Haifa. Would you mind extending the illumination of the shrines just so we can sort of like illustrate how we're doing with public illumination? And the Guardian did. Between the 12th and the 19th of December 2052, he extended the hours of illumination just because they were having that symposium. But maybe the most significant charitable contribution was not a financial one, because it's really, really touching. It was a gesture of empathy on the part of the Guardian, connected to a very deeply cherished holy place of our faith, the House of Aboud, which you see here in this image. In 1943, the district commissioner of Akka wrote to Shoghi Effendi and said, basically, we can't find a space to house a school. We're willing to pay rent if you can lease us 8 rooms in this big house in the center of Akka that is not currently being used. This is a house where Baha'u'llah, the manifestation of God, the supreme manifestation of God for today, lived. This is a holy place. The Guardian allowed the school to use the rooms, and the Guardian refused to accept payment for it. Now, to the subject of this section, the achievements of the first 7-year plan, which ran from 1937 to 1944. So, as we've said before, the reason that the first teaching plan of the formative age happened 16 years after Shoghi Effendi became the Guardian was because the Guardian had to wait 16 years until the national spiritual assemblies and local spiritual assemblies were mature enough to be able to spearhead a teaching plan. And the first try was tested on the communities of North America, the United Nations, the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States and Canada. That was a test. It ended in 1944, in Rizvan of 1944. And American Baha'is succeeded beyond all hope. They doubled the number of local spiritual assemblies in North America. They established one local spiritual assembly in each of the states of the United States and in each province of Canada. And they completed the very expensive exterior ornamentation of the first house of worship in the West, the second Baha'i house of worship after the one in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. And these two goals were reached 16 months before Rizvan 1944. The third goal was to establish a strong Baha'i group in each of the 20 countries in Central and South America and 15 local spiritual assemblies in the region, was also reached, but later. And the Guardian expressed not only his gratitude at these accomplishments and the completion of the North American House of Worship, but he also showered his pride, admiration, and gratitude on the Baha'is of the United States and Canada in a letter called Unconquerable Power. And this is future hand of the cause and the Guardian's future right-hand man and his Hercules, Leroy Iowis, looking very, very handsome. And he is standing in front of one of the panels of the House of Worship in Wilmette. So when you look at the House of Worship in Wilmette, this looks like lace. But then when you see these panels individually, you see how large they are. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the building. 21st of March, 1944, the tablet of the Centennial. Okay, I love this part so much because I discovered this and I didn't know about this. You're going to love it too. So, God Passes By is in English, of course, but there is a counterpart to God Passes By in Persian, and we know it as the Lawh-e-Karn, or the Tablet of the Centennial, and it has an amazing story. As soon as the Guardian had finished his monumental achievement of God Passes By in English, the very first thing he thought of was, what can I do for Baha'u'llah's long-suffering and persecuted followers in his native land? What can I do for the Persian believers? And so what Shoghi Effendi came up with was the Tablet of the Centennial. It was a 100-year survey of the history and achievements of the Baha'i faith in Iran, the cradle of the faith, in the form of a lengthy and momentous letter to the Iranian Baha'i community on the occasion of Nowruz 1944, so ahead of the Centennial by 2 months. But it was read at Rizvan over the course of a very solemn pilgrimage ceremony at the house of the Bab in Shiraz. This letter is known as a Lawh-e-Karn, which means Tablet of the Centennial. But this is important, is that Shoghi Effendi did not give this title to the letter. This is what we call it. It was a Nowruz letter that the Guardian didn't give a title to, but it has become known in Baha'i culture as the Tablet of the Centennial. So the Guardian's written Persian in this tablet is very high, very classical. It's just absolutely stunning Persian. And it's sprinkled with Arabic throughout. And the style of the tablet is as different to spoken Persian as Shakespeare is to spoken English. Shoghi Effendi wrote the tablet of the Centennial by chanting it aloud in Persian to Ruhiya Khanum, who was in the same room, in his very plaintive, painfully beautiful voice. And just like in English, when he chanted in Persian, his words flowed majestically, and their perfection and power was obvious to Ruhiya Khanum, even though the Persian was so high, she could only understand 10% of the words. Sometimes, when he was composing the tablet of the Centennial, the Guardian would hit a block, and he couldn't gracefully fit in the sentence that he wanted to. I couldn't say what he wanted to say in the most graceful way, so he would just stop chanting. Then he would start chanting again that sentence from the start, and he would continue. And if he blocked at the same time, he would stop at the same time, and he would start again and start chanting from the start. And he would chant and chant and chant until he found a way to say what he wanted to say that was elegant and methodical and beautiful. And then he would continue with the rest of the tablet. This is how Ruhiya Khanum describes this very exceedingly beautiful process that the Guardian used to compose Persian while chanting. It was like some wonderful bird trying out its melodies to itself, lost in its own world. You know what? I love that so much, this description of Shoghi Effendi composing, that I'm going to read that again. These are the words of Ruhiya Khanum describing Shoghi Effendi's method of composition in Persian. It was like some wonderful bird trying out its melodies to itself, lost in its own world. This is on the left here. You have both of these men are the greatest contemporary secular non-Bahá'í scholars of Persian literature. His name is Badiüzzaman Foruzanfar. And this one is Said Nafisi on the right. I'm not going to repeat their names because I'm going to butcher them again. So the tablet of the Centennial, like God Passes By, addresses the 100 years of the history of the Baha'i faith. Apart from the tablet of a Centennial sort of covers what happened in Persia, and God Passes By is really for Western audiences. So the area of focus is a little different, but they both deal with the first century of the Baha'i cycle and the Babi dispensation. And of course, the first major difference is in language. God Passes By is in English, the tablet of the Centennial is in Persian. Also, the length. The tablet of the Centennial was about 28,000 words, and it's 1/6 of the length of God Passes By. So it's 6 times shorter. It's the second difference. Third, of the form. God Passes By is definitely a book, and the tablet of the Centennial is definitely a letter. The tablet of the Centennial, however, is a masterpiece in Persian. And it was acclaimed by these two great contemporary scholars, who I repeat were not Baha'is, Badiüzzaman Foruzanfar and Said Nafisi, who considered Shoghi Effendi's Tablet of the Centennial an achievement in Persian literature. I want to, because those of us who don't speak Persian will never be able to read this tablet. So unless it's been I haven't checked if it's been provisionally translated. But there are 3 parts to the Tablet of the Centennial. There is a preamble, there is the body of the letter, and there are closing remarks. The preamble is made up of 3 pages of rare, exceptional beauty and poetic eloquence. Very, very achingly beautiful. And Shoghi Effendi uses a very traditional Eastern etiquette of respect by offering salutation and praise to the names and attributes of God. So it's very different from the way that Shoghi Effendi writes in English. It's very, very, very much like a tablet of Abdul Baha, tablet of Baha'u'llah in Persian, like a lot of praise and salutation and greetings and honor to God. The preamble is rhythmic, actually. It's very, very beautiful when read out loud. And it emits what Hand of the Cause Ali Muhammad Vargha describes as a musical vibration. That is how beautiful it is. And it beckons the reader not to read silently, but to read aloud, the way it was composed by Shoghi Effendi, who composed it aloud. The musicality of Shoghi Effendi's Arabic, Hand of the Cause, Mr. Vargha says, becomes a symphony that fills heart and soul. When one begins to read them, one relishes, one savors every word. So really, the Arabic and Persian of The Guardian are just absolutely out of this world. After this preamble, Shoghi Effendi enters the section of the body of the letter. And in the body of the letter, he lists the Bab, Baha'u'llah's, and Abdul Baha's titles in Baha'i tradition. So same as with in the preamble, when he offers praise and salutation to God, he has lengthy sections where he talks about the titles of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdul Baha. So this is the second section in the preamble. And the third section in the preamble is the wishes of the Guardian to the Iranian Baha'i community. Now, this tablet of the Centennial's content basically are 8 paragraphs on the history of the heroic age, the tragic fate of the enemies of the Bab and Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha, and then instructions for pilgrimage. And these instructions for pilgrimage are specifically for Rizvan 1944, how the Baha'is in Iran are supposed to perform the pilgrimage around the shrine, around the house of the Bab, before they read this letter, which is going to be read in Rizvan, although it was written for Nowruz. So that's the content, basically. And there is a closing prayer that is quite beautiful. It's 5 paragraphs long. I am not going to read it. I apologize. I have to move on to the next section. But please go to the chronology and read this beautiful prayer revealed by Shoghi Effendi as part of the tablet of the Centennial and how he ends this beautiful tablet. I'm also not going to read an excerpt from this tablet of the Centennial. I will let you discover that in the chronology. It will be at the bottom of this video in the description when it's posted. And I'm going to read the opening of this section, and then I'm going to explain something to you. So the 23rd of May, 1944 was a triple centennial. It was the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of the Bab right here. This is the chamber of the Declaration of the Bab. It was 100 years of the inception of the Baha'i cycle, which is to last 5,000 centuries. And it was also the centenary of the birth of Abdul Baha. In the next following sections, which I am not going to read, I'm going to just skim over the Centennial in the Holy Land, because that is where Shoghi Effendi is. And this is a rare and sacred photograph of the inner sanctum and the heart of the Shrine of the Bab from the Baha'i World, Volume 10. The Guardian personally oversaw all of the details of the celebration of the Centennial in the Holy Land. He oversaw the arrangement, the design, the decoration, and the arrangement of the interior of the Shrine of the Bab. And on the 23rd of May, 1944, 150 Baha'is visited the International Baha'i Archives, which were still in the building of the Shrine of the Bab in Abdul Baha at the time. The commemoration itself began shortly after dusk on the 23rd of May, 1944. And the pilgrims visited the Shrine of the Bab in Haifa and the Shrine of Baha'u'llah in Bahji. Then they gathered in the Eastern Pilgrim House and listened to the recording of Abdul Baha chanting a prayer. And they watched the short film of the master shot in 1912 in New York, which was then followed by a spectacular color slide show of the completed house of worship in Wilmette, Illinois, the mother temple of North America. During the Centennial, the Guardian announced for the very first time that he had approved the design for the superstructure of the Shrine of the Bab. Now, if you go to the chronology, you are going to be able to listen to see the Centennial in Shiraz, where the most wonderful, and this picture was taken during the Centennial Annual Convention. This is the National Spiritual Assembly of Iran. I just want to say that a collaborator of mine, this amazing, wonderful, absolutely amazing scholar, Adel Shafipour, who is at the moment doing the world an enormous service by translating the 99 biographies of Masibi Hidayat, 99 biographies of eminent Baha'is and Babis. Oh my God, what a work he is doing. His grandfather, I wrote to him. I was very curious if he had any information on the tablet of the Centennial, so I wrote to him, and I really lucked out because it turns out Dr. Adel Shafipour's grandfather was present at this historical event. And Mr. Ali Akbar Furutam, the future hand of the cause, read the tablet of the Centennial to the assembled Baha'is. And Dr. Adel Shafipour wrote to me in an email and said to me that his grandfather told him that many of the delegates would cry out, Amr Javan Shud, Amr Javan Shud. The cause has been rejuvenated at various parts of the tablet of the Centennial as a comment on how invigorating the writing of Shoghi Effendi was, that he had renewed and rejuvenated the cause that was celebrating its 100 years. So it was 100 years old, but it was so young still. Anyway, and then at 2 hours, 11 minutes after sunset, the opening chapter of the Qayyumul Asma, which was the very thing that started the Babi dispensation at 11 hours after sunset, 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset, was recited in the very room that it was originally recited on exactly 100 years ago, to the day, to the minute, to the hour, and to the second. And at the time, there had been only one Baha'i, and now there were Baha'is everywhere. So what you can read and the chronology, where Shoghi Effendi does not appear really, is the All-American Centennial in Chicago and Wilmette, the Centennial in the United Kingdom, the Centennial in Australia, the Centennial in Egypt, and this is the women's Centennial in Egypt. Pretty cool. The Centennial in India, the Centennial in Iraq, the Centennial in Latin America. And by Latin America, I have included, hold on, let me just, Haiti, Cuba, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia. So you can go and read about those. January to November 1944, the publication of God Passes By. Preparing God Passes By for publication. So now I have a question for you. If you've read any of the Guardian's letters or any of the Universal House of Justice's letters or God Passes By or the Dawnbreakers, you have noticed Roman letters that look like this. There are dots under D, Z, T, H. There are acute accents under over I and A. And then all of the letters KH, SH, and DH are underlined. These are called diacriticals, and they express a certain sound. And in 1944, when Shoghi Effendi was publishing God Passes By, they had to be added manually. I went ahead and I actually counted using a programming tool how many diacriticals there are in God Passes By. These D, Z, I, S, H, A, T, K, H, S, H, D, H. Do you know how many there are? 9,537. There were 3 copies of God Passes By when Shoghi Effendi finished typing it, which means you multiply that by 3 and you get the number above, 28,611 diacriticals, which Shoghi Effendi and Ruhiya Hanum had to manually, with a pen, add or underline to the manuscripts, Shoghi Effendi, triplicate manuscripts that Shoghi Effendi had typed. They did this word for word, page for page, batch by batch, until their eyes were bloodshot, until their vision was blurry, until Shoghi Effendi's back and arms were stiff with exhaustion. Why did they do this? Because they had to have them perfect so they could send them to the printers so the printer could add the diacriticals in exactly the right place. This is 2 years of continuous work by this point. And Ruhiya Hanum and Shoghi Effendi were absolutely exhausted. But for 2 years, they had referred to this manuscript as the survey, the review, or the manuscript. And actually, my favorite name that they gave it, the nickname they gave it was Ruhiya Hanum always called it the book. I just love that so much. Why? Because it didn't have a title. Well, guess what, guys? I'm going to tell you the story of how God Passes By got its title. George Townshend's search for a title. I love this story. The Guardian asked George Townsend to come up with a title for his manuscript. The rest of the story that I'm about to tell you comes from a former member of the Universal House of Justice and the eminent Baha'i historian Adib Taherzadeh, who was a member of the Irish Baha'i community. And he, Adib Taherzadeh, had a long-standing friendship with future hand of the cause. Well, at the time that he was friends with him, he was already a hand of the cause, George Townsend. But in the story here, he's not yet a hand of the cause. So George Townsend, they had like these meetings together where they would just have wonderful conversations. And in the course of one of these meetings, George Townsend told Adib Taherzadeh, I did not know what to do. The Guardian had asked George Townsend to come up with a title for the manuscript. George Townsend had absolutely no idea. So he didn't do anything. Shoghi Effendi sent George Townsend cables. Now, you know Shoghi Effendi, he never forgets any detail, and he's perseverant. So he sent cables, and he started pressuring George Townsend to come up with a title, asking him to give the manuscript, a name, asking him to expedite. Nothing came to George Townsend, and he was just absolutely not inspired. Message after message, cable after cable came from Shoghi Effendi. And finally, George Townsend thought to himself, well, I mean, I must send a telegram to Shoghi Effendi, give a name to this book. What shall I call it? So, with absolutely no inspiration and absolutely no idea what he was going to cable Shoghi Effendi, George Townsend got on his bike and started writing where he was living in Oh my God, this is an Irish. You know what? Gaelic words are harder to pronounce than Persian words because this is Ahaskragh, and there's just basically consonants. So I don't know how to say it. Askrag, Ashkrag, towards the only reliable post office in the center of Dublin, 16 kilometers away from his home. Still with no idea what he was going to write Shoghi Effendi when he got to the post office. He did not have a title for the book. So George Townsend is biking through this unpronounceable city's name, biking, and he's like biking towards the telegram he has to send Shoghi Effendi, and he's just biking, and all of a sudden, inspiration hits him in the shape of 3 simple words. George arrives at the post office and cables the Guardian 3 words: God passes by. Immediately, the Guardian responds, delighted title, eagerly awaiting letter. The title God Passes By is an English language gem. It's 3 words. God passes by. It's like he passes by and no one notices. He passes by. It's like passes by is like the most delicate, sensitive thing. And you can miss it if you don't have your eyes open. He passes by. In French, it's Dieu passe près de nous, which is God passes by close to us, which is terrible. It's not the same. And in Spanish, it's Dios pasa, which means God passes, which is kind of like, but where and how? And he passes. And so English is just the perfect title. Amazing title. The brilliance of George Townsend. God passes by, the essence of essences. This is Ruhiya Khanum's description of God passes by. God passes by, the most brilliant and wondrous tale of a century that has ever been told, is truly a mother of future histories, a book wherein every word counts. Every sentence burgeons with a thought. Every thought leads the way to a field of its own, packed with salient facts. It has the range and precision of snowflake crystals, each design perfect in itself, each theme brilliant in outline, coordinated, balanced, self-contained, a matrix for those who follow on and study, evaluate and elaborate the message of the world order of Baha'u'llah. It was one of the most concentrated and stupendous achievements of Shoghi Effendi's life, the only true book we have of his pen, because all his other communications were, and listen to this, the only true book we have of his pen, because all his other communications were no doubt due to his profound modesty and humility, in the nature of letters addressed to a specific community or section of the Baha'i world. I just want to pause on this for 1 second and say that it really takes a soul as special as Ruhiya Khanum, was hand of the cause, daughter of a hand of the cause and of a martyr, wife of the guardian of the Baha'i faith, to put this analysis of the guardian's works, that he only wrote one book out of sheer humility. And all the other ones that were the length of books, like Promised Days Come is 141 pages, he wrote in the shape of letters because he was humble. See, that is just, je peux rien faire. Okay. Okay, so now the structure and content of God Passes By. The foreword to God Passes By. So the foreword to God Passes By has a majestic description of the content of the 4 periods of God Passes By. And so really just introduces this, and it's written by Shoghi Effendi. And the first period, of course, is the ministry of the Bab between 1844 and 1853. The ministry of the Bab extends 3 years after his martyrdom on the 9th of July, 1950, because it continues until Baha'u'llah gets the revelation from God in the Siat-Chal in 1852-1853. And so this, of course, looks at the main events of the Babi dispensation, the life of the Bab, like his early life, and then his pilgrimage to Mecca, his public declaration. But before that, of course, the 18 Letters of the Living, etc. Basically, the ministry of the Bab. The second period is the ministry of Baha'u'llah, and it follows Baha'u'llah from the Siat-Chal to Baghdad and Istanbul and Edirne and Akka and the mansion of Mazra and the mansion of Bahji and the ascension of Baha'u'llah. And then it follows the third period of the ministry of Abdul Baha after the passing of Baha'u'llah, his life in Akka, his move to Haifa, his 3-year journeys in the West, his return, and his service to the glory of his last few years, and all of the major tablets that he reveals late in his life, and of course his ascension. And then where it gets interesting is the fourth period, the inception of the formative age. Now, this image here, you may recognize, is the will and testament of Abdul Baha, where he names Shoghi Effendi as the guardian of the faith. This period, the fourth period, is in fact the guardianship. It's the period of Shoghi Effendi as the guardian of the faith. And you will not see that referenced in that way in God Passes By. And if there is anything that really made me fall in love with the Guardian, apart from the fact that he would write these long books and just call them letters, there's so much humility on his side, and just the humility of really not talking about himself at all in the period that is really defined by his guardianship. You have to just think, where else but in the faith do you see this authority that's divinely given to a being like the guardian, and him really showing so much humility in telling the story of his time? So one of the subjects that Shoghi Effendi tackles is the rise of the Baha'i administrative order, drawing its origins from the will and testament of Abdul Baha. And he explains that the formative age is this period of gradual development where the nascent Baha'i institutions are strengthening. He demonstrates the futility of the covenant breakers who try to destabilize the faith and they never manage to. Then he talks about the growth that's happened in the last 20 years since the passing of Abdul Baha and the extraordinary achievements of the Baha'i institutions and Baha'i individuals, never once mentioning that the only reason that they were able to do any of this is because of him. Sorry. And he talks a lot about the successes of the United States, and he talks with so much love about the accomplishments of individuals such as Martha Root, singled out her priceless services, her 4 times around the world, and the conversion of the Queen Marie of Romania, and also the contribution of the American Baha'is in spreading the faith to all corners of the earth. Now, many don't realize that there is also a third part, a fourth, fifth, sixth part to God Passes By, and that is an amazing section called Retrospect and Prospect. This is a 14-paragraph conclusion written by Shoghi Effendi, in which he reviews the salient, the most important episodes that marked Baha'i history in the last 100 years, retrospect, while he looks forward to the development of the Baha'i faith, prospect. And Shoghi Effendi has a particularly elegant and apt description for the advancement of the faith in this section, where he doesn't only describe the spiritual nature and characteristics of the process of the advancement of the faith, but he traces it methodically from Persia to Iraq to the Holy Land to every continent in the world in a single sentence, a single achingly beautiful sentence. And this is it. A process, God-impelled, endowed with measureless potentialities, mysterious in its workings, awful in the sense of makes you feel a feeling of awe, not awful as in bad, awful in the retribution meted out to everyone seeking to resist its operation, infinitely rich in its promise for the regeneration and redemption of humankind, has been set in motion in Shiraz, has gained momentum successively in Tehran, Baghdad, Adrianople, and Akka, has projected itself across the seas, poured its regenerative influence into the West, and manifested the initial evidences of its marvelous, world-energizing force in the midst of the North American continent. So finally, God Passes By is published, and this is the announcement in Baha'i News, issue 172, $2.50 a copy. Publishing committee has been immersed in the great but inspiring task of filling orders on this book, which amounted to more than 1,000 copies by November 9th, the publication date, blah, blah, blah. So it's now for sale. And there was a delay in publication. It was supposed to be published by the 23rd of May, 1944, but unfortunately, it wasn't made available until the 15th of November, 1944, because of several reasons. You know, it was still in the middle of the war and all of that stuff. Okay, so now covenant breaking. 1944, 1945. 7th of November, 1944, Munib Shahid. So this is why covenant breaking is so frustrating, because Munib Shahid was like Baha'i royalty. He had the best Baha'i pedigree you could dream. He was the grandson of the king of martyrs, the most illustrious of the apostles of Baha'u'llah, who was savagely killed with his brother, the beloved of martyrs. His father was Munir Khanum's cousin. So he was the nephew of the wife of Abdul Baha. His mother was Ruha Khanum. So the third daughter, no, his father was Munir Khanum's cousin. And his grandmother was Munir Khanum. His mother was Ruha Khanum, Abdul Baha's third daughter. And he was, by default, the grandson and great-grandson of Baha'u'llah, just like the Guardian. The Guardian was the grandson of Abdul Baha and the great-grandson of Baha'u'llah. And Munib Shahid contracted a Baha'i marriage with a woman who was the great niece of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was an enemy of the faith. And in doing so, he forced Shoghi Effendi to denounce him publicly as Munib Shahid, grandson of both Abdul Baha and the King of Martyrs, married according to Muslim rites, the daughter of a political exile who is nephew of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. This treacherous act of alliance with the enemies of the faith merits condemnation in the entire Baha'i world. So another member of his family. And now, basically, 6 months later, Hussein Rabbani, on the 16th of April, 1945, Shoghi Effendi's own brother, born immediately after him, his closest sibling in age, and Hussein Rabbani had been Shoghi Effendi's secretary for many years. When Hussein Rabbani's covenant breaking became common knowledge, and it became obvious to the Guardian that he had to excommunicate him, it was so difficult for Shoghi Effendi to do this to his own brother, who was the closest to him in age, that he held off sending the cable designating his brother as a covenant breaker for 8 full months. He had the cable ready and did not send it for 8 months because it was so hard. Never think it was easy for the Guardian to name anyone covenant breaker. They are signing away their everlasting soul. It would have been the most difficult thing the Guardian ever did. He tried to remedy the situation with his brother Hussein. He showed patience, he showed spirituality and kindness and empathy, and he was forbearing dealing with his brother, hoping against hope he would not have to send the cable, but in the end he had to. My faithless brother Hussein, after long period of dishonorable conduct, has abandoned the master's home to consort with his sister and other covenant breakers. 1945, Shoghi Effendi's pain. Between 1940 and 1945, Shoghi Effendi's family was breaking the covenant right and left. And all the other covenant breakers who lived in Iran and in America were just continually attacking Shoghi Effendi. The administrative order and the covenant, and Ruhiya Khanum kept notes on Shoghi Effendi's suffering. These 3 excerpts are from her diaries. He goes on, but it is like a man in a blizzard who sometimes cannot even open his eyes because of the blinding snow. He is like a man whose skin has been burnt off. It is a miracle he can keep going. I feel sure the tide will turn, but oh, never, never to find Shoghi Effendi as he was. I don't think anything in this world will ever be able to efface what these last years have done to him. Time is a great healer, but it cannot remove scars. It seems it is all irretrievably broken. Finally, 8 May 1945, the end of World War II. This is such a joyful picture. It's a truck of partygoers passing through the Strand in London as they celebrate the end of World War in Europe on the 8th of May, 1945. Adolf Hitler, the Nazi leader, committed suicide on the 30th of April, 1945, a week before, during the Battle of Berlin. Hitler's successor, Karl Donitz, signed an act of military surrender at 2:41 a.m. on the 7th of May, 1945, in Reims, France. And the definitive German instrument of surrender was signed 24 hours later in Berlin on Tuesday, May 8th, 1945. And celebrations exploded throughout Europe. And Churchill addressed a large crowd at Whitehall and said, "God bless you all. This is your victory. In our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. Everyone, man or woman, has done their best. World War II was officially ended." And a joyful cable from The Guardian. This is an image of the residents of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, celebrating the surrender of Japan. On the 9th of May, 1945, the day after the end of the war, Shoghi Effendi wrote a cable that's a little bit long. I'm just going to read the first line. "Followers Baha'u'llah throughout 5 continents unanimously rejoice partial emergence, war-torn humanity from titanic upheaval, unerringly predicted 70 years ago by pen author Their Faith." Of course, the end of World War II is one thing, but the aftermath of World War II is quite another. This is the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941. And these are the two atomic bombs on the 6th of August, 1945 in Hiroshima, and on the 9th of August, 1945 in Nagasaki. So war ravaged the entire earth, all the way to the very heart of the Pacific in Hawaii. 200,000 civilians were killed when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's 1/5 of a million people killed in a matter of seconds. And 20 million people died in the Soviet Union and in China, both soldiers and civilians. Europe lived through the indescribable horror of the Holocaust with 6 million European Jews and 5 million Soviet prisoners of war. This also left a mark on Shoghi Effendi. The aftermath of the war on him exhausted and strained him. Although he never stopped putting out so much energy, he single-handedly kept the Baha'i world together. And his sole support during all this time was Ruhiya Khanum. The Guardian's entire family had spiritually died, and they had abandoned him completely. The only person he had left at his side were some few faithful Baha'is and his wife, Ruhiya Khanum. And at the end of World War II, Shoghi Effendi was 48 years old. His hair was starting to turn white at the temples. His shoulders were bent from thousands of hours arched over his desk and never-ending work. And Ruhiya Khanum felt that what he had gone through had not only saddened his heart, but wore him out. Right after the end of World War I, we don't have any more precise date than that, Shoghi Effendi and Ruhiya Khanum traveled to Scotland. This is the Jacobite steam train, which was running at the time that Shoghi Effendi and Ruhiya Khanum traveled to Scotland. We don't know anything about this trip. We don't know what they did. All we know is that immediately after the war, they went to Scotland. This is also undated, and it's in the years after the war. It's just a tiny little vignette of one of Ruhiya Khanum's pleasant days in London with her beloved guardian. She says, I particularly remember one peaceful hour when we sat on a bench facing the lake on a midsummer afternoon in St. James Park in London, and he read Gibbon out loud to me. July 10th, 1945, the passing of Ali Asghar Qazvini. Ali Asghar Qazvini served the Guardian for 25 years with the greatest loyalty, love, and discretion. And among his many duties was postman to the Guardian. He worked until the very, very, very end of his life. But even though he was strong as an ox, in the last year of his life, in 1945, when he was 75, he was ravaged by an incurable disease. On the 6th of July, 1945, he was admitted to the hospital after his health had been declining for several days. Shoghi Effendi went to see him in person in the hospital and returned home and realized his beloved Ali Asghar was not long for this world. And he told Ruhiya Khanum, all I had left was you and your father and Ali Asghar. And now God takes Ali Asghar. And Shoghi Effendi began planning an extraordinary, an exquisite, a deeply touching funeral for his faithful friend. On the 7th of July, 1945, Ali Asghar's last gift to the Guardian. This is a really very sweet story because on the one hand, the Guardian gives Ali Asghar, his beloved friend and helpmate for 25 years, a beautiful gift. But on the other hand, Ali Asghar gives the Guardian an extraordinary gift. So the next day, July 7th, 1945, Ruhiya Khanum stayed with Ali Asghar until for 4 hours, from 4 to 8 p.m. and conveyed a message from the Guardian. The Guardian had written a letter to the Iranian Baha'is about Ali Asghar and said, called him the lion of the forest of the love of God. And Ruhiya Khanum said that the cutest little smile of happiness went over his face when he heard that the Guardian had called him a lion. And Ali Asghar was silent for a little bit, and he was just whispering blessings and affections to the Guardian. And then he told Ruhiya Khanum to say that he had copied in beautiful handwriting the Centenary Review, the tablet of the Centennial in Persian, and he wanted his manuscript to be bound with the money that he had left. He had very little money left, but he wanted part of that money to be used to bind his manuscript copy of the tablet of the Centennial and offer it as his last gift to Shoghi Effendi. On the 10th of July, 1945, Ali Asghar died. He had written his will and testament, and he only had 2 wishes because he had so little. He donated all his books and few personal effects to the men's library in the Eastern Pilgrim House. And then all the money he had left was 40 pounds, and he gave it to Shoghi Effendi. After his passing, the Guardian himself visited the shrines of the Bab and Abdul Baha and instructed a believer to bring him all the flowers from both thresholds. Then he went in alone into the room where Ali Asghar had died, and he anointed Ali Asghar and laid out the flowers reverently around his body and wept for his friend. When he returned home that night, he told his wife, Ruhiya Khanum, something exceedingly touching, that when he was alone with Ali Asghar's body, his thought had been, how that man has served me. And he told Ruhiya Khanum that he pulled down the sheet that was covering his face and looked at Ali Asghar's face, and Ali Asghar didn't look dead. He looked so natural that the guardian wanted to say to his beloved friend, Ali Asghar, wake up, get up. The day after his passing on 11 July 1945 was the funeral of Ali Asghar, completely organized by Shoghi Effendi, and it was so perfect. Shoghi Effendi gave the eulogy for Ali Asghar, called for the coffin to be brought to the upper room of the Eastern Pilgrim House. The prayer of the dead was read, and Shoghi Effendi sprinkled attar of rose on Ali Asghar's coffin. The guardian's hand was the first to reach out to raise his coffin, which was brought out to the car, and he had a 25-car funeral for the postman of the guardian, organized by Shoghi Effendi. And Shoghi Effendi instructed that all the flowers from all the shrines be brought to Ali Asghar's grave. And that, my friends, is our guardian and how he never forgot anyone. I'm going to go quickly in this part because there's a couple of things that I want to read. I'm just going to tell you what's in it, and then you can go to the chronology and discover it for yourselves. So between 1944 and 1946, because of the Second World War, there is a 2-year break before the next 7-year plan is inaugurated. Then in 1944 is one of only 2 statements which the Guardian makes in regards to his infallibility. And the statement he makes in 1944 is, the infallibility of the Guardian is confined to matters which are strictly related to the cause and interpretations of the teachings. He is not an infallible authority on other subjects such as economics or science. Then there is a little matter of the Guardian having full jurisdiction over all national spiritual assemblies. This I'm going to skip over. You can understand it just as well as you understand that the Universal House of Justice has full jurisdiction over all national spiritual assemblies. In 1944, the Guardian published a world survey of the Baha'i faith. Now, we're going to see this 2 more times in this chronology. The Guardian absolutely loved statistics. He had a passion for statistics. And these pamphlets that he will publish 3 times during his guardianship have to do with the number of national spiritual assemblies, the number of local spiritual assemblies, the languages in which literature is translated, the countries that are open to the faith, Baha'i properties, the number of countries where marriage can be performed, the number of countries where Baha'i holy days are acknowledged. But you know what? There is a really, 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 really cute, my favorite section is absolutely adorable, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the faith. It's called Comparative Measurements of Famous Domed Structures. Basically, in the middle of all these Baha'i statistics, the beloved Guardian, our beloved Shoghi Effendi, lists his favorite domes. Domes, D-O-M-E-S, like St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, St. Paul's in London, St. Sophia in Constantinople, and the Pantheon in Rome. And I just love that in the middle of all these Baha'i statistics, there's this random list of Christian monuments that have nice domes. I love it. I think it's really funny. And I just think it's adorable. Sayyid Mustafa Rumi was a great teacher in Burma and India, and he was the one who accompanied the sarcophagus of the Bab built in Burma to the Holy Land. He died in 1945 and was elevated as a hand of the cause. And this is the section we're going to end on today. Shoghi Effendi's love of words. I'm going to try to give you a sampling because it's a very long section, but I love words too. And the Guardian had a very elevated writing style, and his personal tastes for everything were just absolutely impeccable. And he didn't love very many things, but the things he loved with great passion. And so that explains how he attained such a perfect command of English, because his standard for English was just a couple of works that he really, really, really liked. And his style was just absolutely uncompromising. And so one of the things that The Guardian loved was Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 6 volumes, and the Holy Bible of the King James Version. That was something that The Guardian absolutely loved. Edward Gibbon was an 18th century sort of historian, and the King James Bible has this sort of way of treating the sacred word and the holy word that is so absolutely momentous and majestic and elegant. And you can see the influence of the King James Bible in, for example, gleanings from the writings of Baha'u'llah and certain tablets. It's just very, very, very obvious. No. This is really interesting. I really like this. When I discovered this, I thought this was really interesting. Ugo Giaccheri, the hand of the cause, who was also the assistant of the Guardian for the building of the superstructure of the Shrine of the Bab and the International Baha'i Archives, outlined, according to his own analysis, the 3 animating forces which permeated Shoghi Effendi's literary output. And they were his great vision and ability, with passion and zeal, to project himself into the far distant future, that ability that he had to visualize the future and write about it. 2, his unfaltering conviction of the ultimate triumph of the faith of Baha'u'llah, which Ugo Giaccheri feels permeates all of Shoghi Effendi's Baha'i writings. The absolute confidence that we shall overcome, or this faith shall overcome. And 3, his faith in the accomplishments of the Baha'is worldwide. And I think that you'll see that each of these combine to really give the Guardian's writings that sort of energy and bounce that they have, like that confidence, that strength, that superhuman power that is in there comes from these 3 animating forces that inform his literature. These are all letters. All of these are letters except for the Dawnbreakers and God Passes By. And these are literary, momentous, and majestic, and they elicited in Baha'is intense emotions, but they also educated them and inspired them, encouraged pioneers, praised the heroes and the heroines, shared the news of victories won in the field. So these letters and the Guardian's beautiful English really served as a way to tie the worldwide Baha'i community together. And of course, Shoghi Effendi's method of writing. When we've seen this already with God Passes By. Actually, I'm going to skip this because this is exactly the way that he wrote God Passes By. Researched, took notes in notebooks, rewrote longhand, retyped with the 2-finger method, and sent to publication. So the Guardian used words like mosaics. He had a very precise way of writing. He built his sentences with a very specific effect in mind. And if he ever encountered a difficult sentence whose structure couldn't express what he wanted to do, he never gave up. And Ruhiya Khanum, in one of her talks, says that he was tenacious, he was resilient, and he never gave up. Even if he had to fight with a sentence for 45 minutes, he never, ever gave up until he finally was able to do it. The Guardian was really a poet, which is very clear in this just this one sentence from God Passes By, the first page, first paragraph. We behold, as we survey the episodes of this first act of a sublime drama, the figure of its master hero, the Bab, arise meteor-like above the horizon of Shiraz, traverse the somber sky of Persia from south to north, decline with tragic swiftness and perish in a blaze of glory. When you read it out loud, you can feel Shoghi Effendi wrote it out loud. And you know, the other thing that's very amazing about his sentences is I have this quote here, and I've circled in pink all the P's, because he used to love rhyming, which is vowels, and alliteration, which is consonants. Listen to this, how this pops. Time pressing, opportunity priceless, potent aid, providentially promised unfailing. This is done absolutely on purpose. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about Shoghi Effendi's writings in Persian and Arabic, because, you know, we don't have enough chance. Those who don't speak Persian and Arabic don't have enough of a chance to familiarize themselves with it. And Shoghi Effendi's style in Persian, I'm sorry. Shoghi Effendi's style in Persian is as extraordinary and luminous to Persian speakers as his English is to Anglophones. What the Guardian's writings in English and Persian have in common is their beauty, their surgical precision, with not a single word in excess, their sublime elevated tone, their distinctive, inimitable hallmark Shoghi Effendi flourish, their systematic structure with a passionate message that heightens the whole work, and a spiritual rhetoric. Shoghi Effendi is a writer, a very talented literary writer in both languages. But he just has the ability to convey a spiritual message and have a spiritual effect on the readers. Shoghi Effendi's style in Persian is exquisite, dignified, and elegant, according to Mr. Ali Asghar in The Range and Power of His Pen, which is an amazing essay you should really read, freely available online. Ali Asghar, The Range and Power of His Pen. Persian scholars unacquainted with Shoghi Effendi examined his writing style and classified it at the level of great Persian classic literary occasions. There's only 5 times in his entire ministry that Shoghi Effendi wrote dual English and Persian messages for the Baha'is in the West and the Baha'is in the East. The passing of the greatest holy leaf, 1. 2, the centenary of the declaration of the Bab. 3, the launch of the 10-year crusade. 4, the centenary of the Baha'i revelation. And 5, the completion of the superstructure of the shrine of the Bab. And Shoghi Effendi revealed around 20 prayers during his lifetime, some in Arabic, some in Persian. And of course, one of the major differences between Shoghi Effendi's writings in English and Persian was the persecution of the Friends in Iran. So that would be like a constant component of his letters to the Friends in Iran, and not always into the Friends in America. And unusually, for those of us who know the Guardian's English, sometimes the Guardian opens a letter to the Friends in Iran, invoking the voice of Baha'u'llah or Abdul Baha, as if Baha'u'llah or Abdul Baha themselves were addressing the sorely oppressed friends, while Shoghi Effendi was writing them a letter. So, for example, this gives a translation by Mr. Ali Asghar of a letter to the Friends in Iran dated 19 December 1923. This is the Guardian speaking to the Friends in Iran. Abdul Baha's eyes are now directed towards his grieved and afflicted ones. From his exalted station, he is addressing the people of Baha in this world of dust and conveying to them these exhortations. friends, this is it for today. We'll see you, those of you who can join us next week. See you next week for The Guardian, Part 14, 1946 to 1951, the International Baha'i Council. That's it for me today. Thank you so much. Have a lovely morning, day,